Article 5. Amendment process. Signed in Convention September 17th, 1787. Ratified June 21st, 1788. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call the convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as a part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and the fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of the equal suffrage in the Senate. Common interpretation by Marco B. Rampaport and David H. Jones. Article 5 of the Constitution says how the Constitution can be amended, that is, how provisions can be added to the text of the Constitution. The Constitution is not easy to amend. Only 27 amendments has been added to the Constitution since it was adopted. Article 5 spells out a few different ways in which the Constitution can be amended. One method, the one used for every amendment so far, is that the Congress proposes an amendment to the states. The states must then decide whether to ratify the amendment. But in order for Congress to propose an amendment, 2/3 each house of Congress must vote for it. And then 3/4 of states must ratify the amendment before it is added to the Constitution. So if slightly more than 1/3 of the House of Representatives, or slightly more than 1/3 of the Senate, or 13 out of the 50 states object to a proposal, it will not become an amendment by this route. In that way, a small minority of the country has the ability to prevent an amendment from being added to the Constitution. Article 5 does potentially provide a way for the states to bypass Congress, although it has never been used. Article 5 says that on the application of the 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states, Congress shall call the convention for proposing amendments. The convention can propose amendments whether Congress approve them or not. Those proposed amendments would then be sent to the states for ratification. As with an amendment proposed by Congress, 3/4 of the states would have to ratify the amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. Article 5 also allows Congress to choose between two ways, that is, the states might ratify an amendment. Amendment can be ratified by the state legislature, the part of the state government, and enact laws for the state. But Congress can provide instead that the states must call conventions for the single purpose of deciding whether to ratify an amendment. So far, though, with one exception, the 21st Amendment, every amendment has been ratified by state legislatures. The amendments to the Constitution have come in waves. The first 12 amendments, including the Bill of Rights, were added by 1804. Then there were no amendments for more than half a century. In the wake of the Civil War, 3 important amendments were added. The 13th, outlawing slavery. In 1865, the 14th, mainly protecting equal civil rights. In 1868, and the 15th, forbidding racial discrimination in voting in 1870. At the time, there were questions about whether those amendments have been properly ratified by the states because it was unclear whether the Confederate States, which had seceded from the Union, were part of the United States again. Today, though, no one doubts that those amendments are part of the Constitution. After the Civil War amendments, another 43 years passed until the Constitution was amended again. Then 4 more amendments, 16th through 19th, were added between 1930 and 1920. 7 more amendments were adopted at pretty regular intervals between 1920 and 1971. But except for one were unusual amendment, there has been no amendments to the Constitution since 1971. The unusual amendment is the 27th Amendment. It was proposed with the original Bill of Rights in 1789 and was ratified by a half-dozen states within a few years and then mostly ignored. But Article 5 says nothing about the time period within which 3/4 of the states had to ratify a proposed amendment. From time to time, another state would end its ratification. Finally, in 1992, more than 200 years after the amendment was first proposed, the ratification finally reached the 3/4 line, and the 27th Amendment has been considered part of the Constitution since then. For recent proposed amendments, though, Congress has specified that the amendment must be ratified within 7 years or it would lapse, so this situation is likely to happen again. But other issues might arise. For example, Article 5 says that an amendment that has been proposed to the states will become part of the Constitution if 3/4 of the states ratify it. What if a state ratifies quickly and then before many other states ratify, changes their mind, try to rescind, that is, to take back its ratification? Can a state do that? Some commentators would say no. Once a state has ratified, then counts towards the required 3/4, no matter what the state does later. But other commentators would say that the state can rescind its ratification so long as it does so before the amendment process has been completed. So there is no definite answer to this question. This kind of uncertainty might be worth troubling. We might not know for sure whether a proposed amendment was a part of the Constitution or not. Finally, Article 5, while spelling out how the Constitution can be changed, made 2 things unchangeable even through the difficult amendment process. One is that no state without its consent shall be deprived its equal suffrage in the Senate. So every state will have the same number of senators no matter how many members of Congress or other states want to change as then part of our system, unless a state agrees to accept a smaller number of senators. Article 5 also says in language that is hard to follow and has no legal effect today that until 1808, no amendment could limit the slave trade. A reminder that there are parts of the Constitution that we can be thankful were amended. Mandarin debate. The first perspective is originalism, an essential ingredient of the constitutional amendment process, by Michael B. Rampart. Originalism, the view that we ought to follow the Constitution's original meaning, holds that the constitutional amendment process should be the primary means for constitutional change. The amendment process, however, has been criticized for having 2 defects. One is that it is too strict and therefore makes it too difficult to enact amendments. The other is that it is biased in favor of the federal government, and therefore does not allow amendments that would limit the national government. All of these are important criticisms. This defect do not derive from the amendment process itself, but instead from the failure to employ the Constitution's original meaning. If the original meaning were consistently followed, both defects would be eliminated. Some critical originalism argue that the amendment process is too strict because it is difficult to secure approval by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 2/4 of states. Therefore, these critics contend the Supreme Court should engage in non-originalist judicial interpretation to allow for modern circumstances and value to be incorporated into the Constitution. The amendment process, however, is not too strict to allow for constitutional change. It's true that the process does require amendments to be supported by a consensus, but there are powerful reasons for requiring such a support, such as preventing constitutional provisions that are strongly opposed by a substantial minority of the country from being enacted, which would undermine the nation's allegiance towards the Constitution. See John O. McJennings and Michael B. Rapoport, Originalism and the Good Constitution, 2013. Moreover, the strict amendment process has not excessively impeded constitutional change, as it has allowed for many significant constitutional amendments over the nation's history, including the Bill of Rights and amendments concerning the income tax, the direct election of senators and two-term presidency, and the right to vote of women and 18-year-olds. The problem is not that the constitutional amendment process requires consensus, but that the Supreme Court often intervenes before consensus can emerge. A consensus often takes a long time to develop. But if the Supreme Court believes that it can fix the Constitution whenever a significant portion of the country believes the Constitution should be changed, then it will intervene before the amendment process has had a chance to operate. As a result, no amendment will be enacted since the court has already made a change. By contrast, if the original meeting were followed, the amendment process would have the opportunity to enact changes in the Constitution that are supported by a consensus. This analysis helped explain why so much constitutional change has occurred in the last 3 generations through judicial interpretation rather than the amendment process. For example, during the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration did not attempt to pass constitutional amendments to give the federal government a more regulatory power. Instead, it attempted to pack the Supreme Court. While the Roosevelt court packing plan was initially defeated, eventually he placed 8 of the 9 justices on the court and secured radical change in constitutional doctrine. There seemed little doubt that the nation would have supported an amendment that conferred additional regulatory powers, but there is a good chance that the consensus requirement would have meant the federal government would have received less power than the court eventually granted it. A second problem with the amendment system is that its current operation is biased in favor of the federal government. The Constitution provides 2/3 for proposing amendments, while all of the existing amendments have been enacted through the congressional proposed method, in which 2/3 each House Congress proposes an amendment. No amendment has ever passed through the convention method. Under that method, 2/3 of state legislatures can apply for Congress to call a convention that would then decide whether to propose an amendment. The convention method was an essential part of the original Constitution. The drafters of the Constitution recognized that the congressional proposal method was controlled by the federal government. Consequently, it could not be relied upon to reform federal government abuses. The drafters therefore placed the convention method into the Constitution, since this method largely bypasses the federal government. Michael B. Rapoport. The constitutionality of the limited convention, originalist analysis. Unfortunately, this amendment method is broken. Many people who favor constitutional amendments that will limit the federal government are nonetheless unwilling to use this method because they fear what is called a runaway convention, a convention that is called to propose amendments on one subject but then proposes them on other matters. For example, state legislatures might apply for the convention to pass a balanced budget amendment, but the convention might then decide to propose an amendment allowing school prayer. This fearful runaway convention has hobbled the convention method. Over the last several decades, a number of amendments that would have limited the national government's powers have had strong support in the country, such as amendments concerning a balanced budget, congressional term limits, and a line item veto. But since these amendments are generally opposed to Congress's institutional interests, Congress is extremely unlikely to propose them. Some of these amendments, however, would probably have been enacted under a functional convention method. Significantly, the problem of the Runaway Convention is the result, once again, of not following the Constitution's original meaning. Many constitutional commentators have argued that the Runaway Convention is constitutional. In their view, the Constitution does not allow the states to limit the Convention to a particular subject, and therefore the Convention is free to make proposals on any subject of its choosing. But this argument is mistaken. The Constitution says that the states may apply for the Convention for proposing amendments. Is a convention limited to a subject a convention for proposing amendments? Of course it is. Then, thus, a limited convention is one of the conventions for which the states can apply. See Rappaport, Constitutionality for Limited Convention, supra. In the original meaning, if the original meaning were widely accepted, states would feel free to apply for a limited convention without fear for a runaway convention. This arrangement would eliminate the national government bias in the current operation, the amendment process. Thus, both alleged problems with the constitutional amendment process, a bias in favor of the federal government, and the excessive difficulty of enacting constitutional amendments would have been limited if the constitutional meaning were followed. Okay, we're going to come to the next perspective. How we change the Constitution. Hint, it's not by amending it. By David A. Strauss. There are two important things to know about Article 5. The part of the Constitution that spell out how to amend that document. The first is that it's hard to amend the Constitution. The second is that amendments matter a lot less than most people think. Amendments change the text of the Constitution, but the key point where important changes happen when the text of the Constitution stays the same. The institution, in practice, definitely changes, but amendments are not the main ways and those changes happen. These two things, how hard it is to amend the Constitution and how so many changes happen without amendments, are opposite sides of the same coin. Because it is so hard to change the text, we have figured out other ways to make the kind of changes that you might expect to get from amending the text. A nation, like other living things, has to adapt if it is to thrive. If one means of adaptation is closed off, it is to find another way. That is what the United States constitutional system has done. Our constitutional system, our actual system, in the way it actually works, as opposed to what's written down on paper, is changed by Congress. The president, the courts, and often just by changing understanding from among the people, even when the text stays the same. Sometimes people say that while the words of the text of the Constitution haven't changed, the interpretation of the Constitution has. There's no harm in thinking of it that way. What? But however you explain it, the fact is that our understanding of what Constitution means has changed enormously over time, in ways that don't have a lot to do with constitutional amendments. Specifically, these four things are, I think, two. One, there have been important changes in the basic nature of our government that took place without any change in the written Constitution. Two, several amendments that seem to change things were added to the Constitution. The Constitution after the change has already happened in most of the country. The amendment did not cause change, it just confirmed it. 3. A couple of times, a proposal for the constitutional amendment was rejected, and things changed anyway, in the way the amendment would have changed them. The amendment was formally rejected. It's not in the constitutional text, but in practice, it might as well have been adopted. 4. Some amendments that were added to the text tried but failed to change things when they were adopted. But many years later, when the country was ready, it changed in the way the amendment had supposed required long before. Here are some examples of each. 1. Changes that happened even though there's no amendment. For a long time after the nation was founded, the federal government did not do a lot. State governments were much more important. That changed. Today, federal law affects every aspect of our lives. We can't trace that change to any constitutional amendment. Some people will say that all along, the Constitution gave the federal government the potential to play that important role. The federal government just choose not to. Other people might say that the federal government should not be so powerful, but there is no denying this enormous change in our system, and there is no amendment that caused it. 2. Amendment that just confirmed the change that already happened. There are many examples of this, but here's one that a lot of people overlook. When the Constitution was first adopted, the people did not vote for United States senators. State senators were elected by the state legislature. The 17th Amendment provides that senators are elected by popular vote. Many people say that the 17th Amendment made an important change in our system because it took power away from state governments. Having senators elected by the people instead of by state legislators may have been a big change, but the 17th Amendment did not have much to do with it. Before the 17th Amendment was adopted, most states have already cleverly figured out ways to make sure that the people, not the state legislators, elected senators. For example, several states held a popular vote for the Senate, and while officially that vote did not count, any state legislature who did not pledge to follow the result of that vote would have a disparaging label next to his name on the ballot. So, as you can imagine, the legislators followed the people's decision. All that happened before the Constitution was amended. You can compare this change to a change in the way we elect the president. Formerly, the president is elected by electors, not by the voters directly. Originally, the idea was that electors would be people with a good judgment who would make up their own minds about who should be president. Now, for practical purposes, electors vote automatically for the candidate who won the vote in their state. No constitutional amendment authorized this major change. 3. Constitutional amendments that were rejected, but in practice might as well have been adopted. There are a couple of examples, but the clearest one is Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which would have forbidden the federal state governments from denying equal rights on the basis of sex. Congress approved the amendment, but not enough states did, so it never became part of the Constitution. But this according to produce other parts of the Constitution to prevent sex discrimination, and today it is hard to identify any way in which the law would be different if the ERA had not been formally added to the Constitution. 4. Amendments that became effectively only when the country had changed for other reasons. The 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteed that people could not be kept from voting because of their race. It was added to the Constitution in 1870, but well into the middle of the 20th century, African Americans in many parts of the United States were kept from voting by illegal means. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the promise of the 15th Amendment was finally kept. If you just pick up a copy of the Constitution and read it, you would be completely misled about this disgraceful history. The 14th Amendment, adopted in 1865, had a similar fate. It was intended to prevent many forms of discrimination against minorities, but its promise was not realized until almost a century later, during the Civil Rights era. The case can be made that the earliest constitutional amendments did matter, that would include the Bill of Rights, for example, and the 12th Amendment, which would fix the problem in the way the president and vice president were originally chosen. And several amendments have been useful housekeeping measures, like the 25th Amendment, which says that it would happen if the president is disabled. But if you really want to understand how the United States Constitution changes in practice, not just on paper, Constitutional amendments are a small part of the story. The real action, in many ways, our real Constitution is elsewhere, in the way the courts, Congress, the President, and the people in their daily lives have brought us the Constitution we have today.